In the first scene, we see three young people who pledged never to wear jackets again and placed it in the trunk of a car. A 44-year-old man named George is driving to the countryside. He stopped at a gas station and went to the restroom, dropping his old jacket into the toilet. When George flushed, water began to overflow from the toilet due to a blockage. George hurried to leave and continued his journey, while the water kept flowing, filling the restroom. As night fell, George fell asleep in the car and in the morning continued driving until he reached the desired address. Yesterday George had called the ad, so the elderly man, Mr. B, was already waiting for him. George was going to buy a jacket. When he saw it, he was delighted. It was genuine deer leather. According to Mr. B, the jacket was made in Italy. George paid 7,500 euros in cash. As a bonus, the old man gave George a digital video camera that he himself had hardly used. Satisfied with his purchase, George left Mr. B's house and arrived in a neighboring mountain village. George stared at his reflection in the car window for a long time. The jacket definitely suited him. The first thing George did was check into a hotel, saying that he would stay here for at least a month. However, George is having problems with his bank card, so he cannot pay right now. The administrator asked for something valuable as collateral. George gave him his wedding ring, promising that the payment would be made tomorrow. George entered his room. The hotel was almost empty because few people visit these places. George looked at his reflection in the mirror again, feeling he was a tough guy in this jacket. Later, he tried out the video camera given to him by Mr. B. In the evening, George put on his new deer leather jacket and left the hotel, calling his ex-wife and telling her that he had left, as promised. However, she couldn't care less. After finishing the call, George threw his cell phone in the trash and went to a bar, ordering whiskey. At some point, he thought some woman was talking to the waitress about his jacket, although they were discussing something completely different. George said he was used to his jacket attracting attention and that many people asked about it. The woman and the waitress were puzzled, not understanding what was so special about this jacket. When the woman asked George about his line of work, George was initially confused, then lied that he was a movie director. George left the bar. The woman offered him a ride and said he didn't seem like someone from serious cinema. George doesn't understand why she came to such a conclusion, considering his jacket is very expensive. Calling him a loser, the woman left. George couldn't fall asleep for a long time and filmed his jacket, talking to it as if it were alive. Then he wished the jacket good night and went to sleep. Soon George was awakened by strange sounds. He went to check, as did the woman living in the neighboring room. The next morning, George found that his bank account was frozen. He had to search for food in the trash. A mute boy stared at George, which he didn't like. Later, George went to the library and stole a book about cinematography. Then he went to the bank and found out that the ex-wife had blocked his account, so he couldn't withdraw cash. Thus George was left without means to survive, unable to pay for the hotel. At the same time, George continues to talk to his jacket, promising to get the money. George could spend a long time in front of the mirror, filming himself. The waitress, still thinking George was a film director, bought him a drink and asked what movies he makes. George lied that he had a big team. The girl in turn shared that she has been interested in video editing for a long time. She's just an amateur, as there is no film industry work here, but she really dreams of doing it. Leaving the bar, George again talked to his jacket, pondering why he lied to the waitress about his success and everything else. Now George has the phone number of this girl named Denise. At some point, George heard the jacket start talking to him. In reality, of course, it was him speaking for both himself and the jacket. The jacket declared that its main dream is to be the only jacket in the world. It wants to walk with George and not encounter other jackets. George said he understands this desire because his dream is to be the only guy in the world wearing a jacket. The question is how to make it happen. George still has no means to pay for the hotel, so he asked for an extension. The new administrator asked him to leave something valuable as collateral. When George said he already left a ring, it turned out that yesterday the previous administrator voluntarily passed away right there. The body is in the first room until the funeral home staff arrives. With the administrator's permission, George entered the first room and stole his suede hat. Looking at himself in the mirror, George felt like the most stylish man in the world. The fingers wouldn't unclench, so George barely managed to take his wedding ring from the lifeless guy. After that, George left the ring as collateral with the new administrator and promised to pay tomorrow. Meeting Denise, George said his team is supposedly filming in Siberia, so the connection is bad. But he managed to talk to the producers and found out that the position of editor is still vacant, so Denise got the job. Upon hearing this, Denise couldn't believe it. But she suspected something wrong when George suddenly asked her not to wear a jacket anymore. Denise refused, thinking that George was not in his right mind. George explained that he just wants to be the only one wearing a jacket. Despite the strangeness of the request, Denise still complied. Additionally, George mentioned that he lost his bank card, so he couldn't buy tapes or even print the script. They went to the terminal, and Denise withdrew cash, giving it to George. He promised that his producers would write her a check as soon as they were back in touch. George is pleased that at least one person is now without a jacket, but there is still a lot of work ahead. Meanwhile, Denise played the tapes she received from George, preparing to start editing. The video showed George filming himself. George went to a shoe store and bought deer leather boots with Denise's money. After that, George hired several locals to film his movie. Each of them had to pledge on camera never to wear a jacket again and put it in the car trunk. Using Denise's money, George paid off the actors, who asked what strange movie he was making. George said it was a breakthrough in cinema and then simply left, stealing their jackets. By the end of the day, George ran out of money. At some point, he noticed that a mute boy was watching him. Angered, George threw a brick at him. Stealing the last actor's jacket, George hurried away and parked across from the movie theater, filming everything. He pursued one guy, lying that filming was his job. After that, George went to the bar. Denise again bought him a drink and shared that she had started editing. Despite the lack of a script, Denise guessed that the film was about George's jacket. Later, Denise gave George the last €80. Her account was also blocked because she had never withdrawn such sums before. George asked Denise to take the money from the bar's cash register, but she refused. Angered, George left. In his room he reviewed the last video, where he chased the guy. Deeming George insane, the guy refused to take off his jacket, so George ran after him. The video cuts off there. George continues to talk to the jacket, expressing its outrage that George's actions haven't brought them any closer to their dream. At this rate, he'll be the only guy in a jacket in 1,000 years. Obviously, destroying so many jackets in a short period is impossible. Suddenly George got an idea and broke off a blade from the ceiling fan. After that, George sharpened the blade and planned to use it as a weapon. Two guys were just chatting when suddenly a car stopped nearby. George approached them, asking if they would help him fulfill his dream. Returning home, Denise checked the mailbox and found tapes and a letter from George, who wrote that despite the lack of money, he had made heroic efforts to shoot new footage. It could be the last, as there's no word from the producers, which means something terrible happened in Siberia. George hopes that Denise will help him because without funding, he won't be able to finish the film. Denise watched the video where George was chasing the guy. On the second video he approached two guys and took their lives, then took their jackets. Of course Denise thought they were just actors and staging. In the morning, George was cleaning his favorite jacket from traces. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was Denise, who came to talk about his film. Before letting Denise in, George asked her to leave the jacket. Denise believes that George's film will be a sensation, so she has already asked her boss for an advance and gave George the money. Also, as an apology for not doing it earlier, Denise presented him with a gift, pants made of genuine deer leather. George was very happy. After that, they went to a cafe where Denise gave George more money. In return she asked him to provide her with more footage and more action in it. George prepared to carry out his plan and put on a polyethylene raincoat to avoid staining his jacket. Parking near the cinema, he waited. George pursued different people and took their lives to then take their jackets. He filmed all of this. George's main goal is to take as many jackets as possible. He even took the life of the woman from the neighboring room, then cleaned his coat of traces and went to sleep. The jacket continued to talk to him. The next morning, he hired an excavator to dig a large pit. Then George buried all the jackets he could get. He really wants to be the only guy in a jacket in the whole world. Denise offered George the money she inherited from her father and stated that she wants to be not only the editor but also the producer of the film. These $50,000 will be enough to finish shooting. George didn't like that Denise wants to manage the entire budget herself. Denise in turn hinted that she knows he's a fraud. The story about the film crew dying in Siberia is complete nonsense. What unites them is that they both used to be loners. Denise presented George with another gift, gloves made of genuine deer leather. After that, they drove out of town, and George asked Denise to film him. In this costume George feels like the coolest guy in the world. Suddenly a shot rang out. The mute boy's father took George's life. Denise continued filming all this time, then took the jacket off lifeless George and put it on. In the final scene, we see a video of George filming himself in the jacket and approaching a herd of deer. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.